Don't say a word. Follow me." Emmett Halloran had just stepped out onto the stone steps of the estate, adjusting his father's silver ring on his little finger, his phone still in his other hand, and the family council would be seated at the table in exactly 38 minutes. He had no time for whispers. He turned. The gardener, 2 months on this property, always looking at the ground when she passed him, her hands never quite clean of soil, stood at the mouth of the service path, her face pale, her pruning shears still tucked in her apron. "I'm late. What is it?" She stepped closer and took hold of his sleeve. It was not the grip of someone who worked for him. It was the grip of a woman who had already decided something and knew what it would cost her. 2 minutes. If I'm wrong, fire me today. If I'm right, you'll still be alive tonight. He looked down at her hand. One motion would have ended it. He didn't make it. Something in the way she said the word alive, not escape, not survive, but alive, held him still for exactly the length of one breath. That breath cost her nothing and gave her everything. She pulled him down behind the magnolia bed, at the foot of the gate column. From there, he could see the black car waiting, and he began to notice the things he should have noticed long before. The man standing at the door was not Rafferty. Below the cuff of his suit trousers were running shoes, the shoes of a man who had already planned on running, and the engine was silent. In 10 years, Rafferty had never once shut off that engine while Emmett was walking out the door. Not once. Emmett Halloran had walked through that door 1,000 mornings, as the man no one in this city dared to call by name. This was the first morning he had to hide from it, and he still did not know that the most dangerous thing waiting for him that day was not beyond the gate it had been sitting at his own dinner table for 12 years. If this story reached you, leave a like so we know you're here. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it too, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. The phone in Emmett's hand vibrated, and he looked down at the screen for exactly 1 second before answering. Beatrice's voice drifted through, sweet and warm, the same voice that had awakened him through thousands of mornings. "Darling, the car is waiting for you. Don't keep them waiting." Emmett looked toward the woman crouched low beside him behind the flower bed. Ruth shook her head once, slowly and firmly. "I know," he said into the phone, his voice resting exactly where it had always rested for the past 12 years. "I'm coming out now." He ended the call. The screen went dark for 3 seconds. Neither of them moved. Somewhere beyond the row of camellias, a bird called to its mate, knowing nothing at all. Ruth didn't explain. She didn't look toward the black car waiting outside the gate again either, as though that matter had already been settled and she had moved on to the next item on her list. She only said, very softly, "Follow me for 20 more steps. After that, you can fire me if you want." Then she rose, moved along the edge of the flower bed, keeping herself below the line of sight of the person standing outside the gate, and Emmett Halloran, the man no one in the entire city dared address by name, followed his own gardener. They went around through the servants' passage, the narrow path paved with old bricks that he hadn't set foot on in 15 years, and came out behind the greenhouse. Ruth stopped about 1 step from the glass. She didn't move into the light. She only lifted her chin toward what lay ahead and stepped back, making room for him, like someone who knew that what she was about to give another person could never be taken back. Emmett stepped forward, and he saw it before he had the chance to hear anything. Beside the fountain in the courtyard, beneath the early morning sun, Beatrice Ashford was standing next to Warren Pike. They weren't embracing. That was the worst part. If they had been holding each other, he could have told himself it was heat, a moment of weakness, a mistake of the kind men still forgave women for, and women still forgave men for. But what he saw wasn't passion. It was habit. Beatrice lifted a hand to Warren's shoulder, brushed away a dried petal, then straightened his collar with the tips of 2 fingers. The gesture lasted less than 2 seconds. But it was the gesture of a woman who had done that exact thing hundreds of times, on hundreds of mornings, in a house that wasn't her own. Warren didn't thank her. He didn't even look down. People only stopped saying thank you when they had grown accustomed to being cared for. Emmett stood behind the clouded glass and counted all the mornings he had crossed that courtyard on his way to the car, his head lowered over his phone, calculating the numbers of men who lived very far away, while just behind him a woman was straightening another man's collar. Then Beatrice did something that stopped the breath inside his chest. She removed the engagement ring from her finger, the ring he had placed on her hand 1 year earlier in Charleston, beneath a veranda heavy with climbing vines, after she had asked him the same question she had asked for 12 years. She held it up to the sunlight, turning it slowly so the stone caught the light, studying it as though it were an object that had just been appraised again. And she said something, from where he stood, behind the glass, behind the sound of water flowing in the fountain. He couldn't hear a single word. But behind him, Ruth's voice rose very softly, steady and exact, the voice of someone repeating something that had been carved into her memory since the day before and had kept her from sleeping. "It'll look better when he's gone." Out in the courtyard, Beatrice slipped the ring back onto her finger. She smiled. Emmett Halloran had seen that smile at parties, in photographs, in the bedroom mirror, while she brushed her hair and he stood behind her. But he had never seen it turned toward another person in that way. Then the two of them separated and walked toward opposite sides of the courtyard, slowly, without haste, the way two people leave a room when they both know they'll return to it. Emmett didn't roar. He didn't shatter the glass. He didn't call anyone's name. He only reached out and placed his hand on the edge of the wooden potting table beside him, the table covered with soil and the seed trays belonging to the woman standing behind him, and the knuckles of his hand slowly turned white without making a sound. His father's silver ring touched the wood with one faint tap. Ruth said nothing. She understood that this wasn't a moment meant for words, and she was someone who had learned very early that there were times when the kindest thing one human being could do for another was to stand still and not look into their face. There is a kind of silence that comes only after the moment a man understands that the hand touching him every morning is also the hand holding the knife. It isn't the silence of pain. It is the silence of a life ending in one place and beginning, cold and merciless, somewhere else. Ruth waited until the courtyard outside was completely empty, then slipped a hand into the pocket of her apron and took out something Emmett Halloran hadn't held in 20 years. It was a small handheld recorder, its plastic casing yellowed to the color of old ivory, the battery cover no longer fitting properly, and held in place by a brown rubber band wrapped twice around the body of the machine. He stared at it in her hand. That cheap little object, in the middle of an estate where the hedge along the western boundary alone had cost him more than this woman earned in an entire year. "My younger brother is deaf," Ruth said. She didn't say it to ask for sympathy, but in the manner of someone presenting a necessary fact before moving on to the real matter. "He lost his hearing 6 years ago. Every day, while I work, I read my list of tasks into this recorder. At night, I type it all into messages and send them to him, because he likes knowing how my day went. So the recorder is always running while I work. All day. I never turn it off." She paused for a moment. "Yesterday, I was cleaning the glass inside the greenhouse. The office door was open. I didn't know anyone was inside. Then she placed her thumb over the button and looked at him, a brief but unmistakable look. The look of someone making sure the other person was ready, because in another 30 seconds there would be no road back for either of them. She pressed the button. There was a faint hiss, then the distant sound of running water, and then Warren Pike's voice entered the space between them. It was the voice Emmett had heard every week for 9 years, the voice of a man reading financial statements. Steady, clean, without a single rough edge to catch hold of. He spoke about Tuesday morning. He spoke about the car. He said Rafferty wouldn't be there, and that one of his own men would be driving. He spoke about Talmadge Bridge, about the middle section where 2 lanes were under construction, about how much easier it was than people imagined if the right hour was chosen. Then he said one short, precise sentence, without emphasis, exactly the way he might report an expense that had exceeded its budget. "He goes in, and he doesn't come out." Emmett didn't move. On the recording, there was the sound of a glass being set down on wood. Then Beatrice's voice rose. It was the voice that had spoken his name across thousands of breakfast tables. The voice that had asked whether he had slept well the night before. The voice that had told him in Charleston that she didn't need a large wedding, only one day. Now it was softer, warmer, more intimate, and it carried the sound of a smile. "He doesn't suspect you because he trusts you. 12 years. That's the most beautiful part." Emmett Halloran heard those words and felt nothing. No anger, no pain, nothing that had a name. There was only something strange, like missing a stair in the dark, and, in that brief instant of falling, the body understanding what has happened before the mind can catch up. On the recording, Warren said something else, but by then the sound had begun to blur. At the 90th second, it broke apart completely into a dry, crackling noise, like paper being crushed in a fist, and went on that way without end. Ruth switched off the recorder. "That's as far as it goes," she said. "I tried it 4 times last night. After that point, there's nothing left." At that exact moment, the phone in Emmett's hand vibrated for the second time that morning. He looked down at the screen. 3 letters so familiar he could have read them in the dark. Ruth held her breath. Emmett raised the phone to his ear and answered. And what happened next made the woman beside him turn and look at him, because the voice that came out of this man's mouth didn't contain a single crack. It was the voice of an entirely ordinary Tuesday morning, the voice of a man running late and mildly irritated at being questioned. Warren. On the other end, that steady voice said everything was ready, that Rafferty had called in sick early that morning, that the replacement was trustworthy, that the board would be seated at 9:30. Emmett released a very slow breath through his nose, exactly as he would have done on any other morning. "I'm on my way," he said. Then he ended the call. The screen went dark for the second time. He remained still for a while, and he didn't look toward the gate, or the courtyard, or the glass. He looked at Ruth. He looked at her for a long time, longer than necessary, and she allowed him to look. He studied her 2 hands. The soil worked so deeply into the creases of her skin that it could no longer be washed away. He looked at the cheap recorder resting between those palms, and at the brown rubber band wound twice around it, a rubber band that someone, on some evening, inside some apartment he had never once thought about, had carefully fastened there to keep the battery cover from falling off. "Show me everything you have," he said quietly. Everything. Every single word. 2 minutes earlier, he had been the man no one in the city dared address by name. Now, he was crouching behind a greenhouse, and the only thing keeping him alive was 90 seconds trapped inside a recorder held together by a rubber band. Emmett rose first, and this time he took the lead. He didn't turn back toward the main house. He followed the line of camellias, crossed the open ground behind the greenhouse, and headed for the low red tiled tool shed that everyone on the estate called the garden shed, and no one entered except Ruth herself. He pushed open the wooden door, walked between 2 rows of shelves holding shovels and sacks of fertilizer, and at the far end he bent over a floorboard that looked no different from any of the others. Ruth watched him press a finger into a narrow gap, heard a faint click inside the wall, and saw the board lift to reveal a narrow staircase leading underground. She had cleaned that shed 26 times in 2 months. She had swept that exact board with her own broom. She descended behind him, and on the final step her left leg faltered for half a beat. But he was occupied with switching on the light and didn't see it. The room below was small, with bare stone walls, a wooden table, a lamp, and a safe built into the wall. No windows, no cameras, not a single listening device, because for over 13 years, until his lungs forced him to leave 20 months ago, an old man had driven into the city from Tybee Island once every month to personally sweep every corner of that room. And that old man was the only person in the world Emmett Halloran had never felt the need to check twice. He pointed to the chair. Ruth sat down and placed the recorder on the table with both hands, the way someone sets down something both precious and fragile. Emmett took out a cable, connected the recorder to the external speaker at the corner of the table, and pressed play. This time the sound was fuller, clearer, and far worse. Warren Pike's voice filled the stone room as though he were standing there with them. Beatrice laughed softly near the end, and that laughter struck the walls and came back again. Once again, the audio collapsed into harsh static at the exact same point. Emmett rewound it. He listened a second time, one finger tapping lightly against the wood in a rhythm of his own. He rewound it a third time, and now he listened only to the final portion, 3 times in succession, trying to drag a name or an address out of that dry mass of static. There was nothing, only the prolonged sound of paper being crushed. He switched off the recorder. In that windowless room, the silence was as thick as water. 90 seconds, he said. Not enough to understand, enough to die. Ruth didn't ask what he meant. She had understood the night before, when she had listened to it again and again in the darkness of her apartment, and realized that what she was holding wasn't evidence, but a broken fragment of evidence. In those, the short piece of audio, there were no names except those of the 2 people who were both still inside this house. There was no place they intended to take him. No date, no exact time, not a single word he could carry into the long walnut-paneled council room, place on the table before the family board, and say, "Here, this is why I'm accusing my own financial advisor." Before the council, those 90 seconds were merely the sound of an old recording. To Warren Pike, They were an accident that could be dealt with in a single afternoon. Emmett walked the rear wall, slid a wooden panel aside, and entered a sequence of numbers Ruth couldn't see. The safe opened. He removed two things. The first was an old revolver, its steel darkened with age, its grip worn smooth by human hands. It had belonged to his father, and Emmett hadn't held it since the day he buried the old man with a rosary in one coat pocket and a square folded flag in the other. The second was a satellite phone. He placed both objects on the table, sat down across from Ruth, and dialed a number he hadn't called in 20 months. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, someone answered. And then came the voice of a very old man, slow and calm, the voice of someone who had waited years for this call and still hadn't decided whether he ought to feel relieved or sorrowful now that it had finally come. Emmett, Sheldon. Neither man asked what had happened. Neither offered an explanation. In the Halloran family home, there was only one kind of call ever made from the room beneath the tool shed at 9 o'clock in the morning, and both men knew exactly what kind of call it was. The old man released a short breath through the phone. "I'm coming. 3 hours." The line went dead. Emmett set the satellite phone on the table beside his father's revolver and turned toward the woman sitting across from him. "Who is waiting for you at home?" he asked. "Who will come looking if I keep you here?" Ruth lowered her eyes to her hands. "My younger brother," she said. "Nolan, 26 years old." Emmett nodded slowly. In less than an hour, he had lost everything he had ever believed in. All that remained to him was a broken recording, an old man 3 hours away by car, and a woman whose name he hadn't known until that morning. Emmett pulled the desk phone in the corner closer and began doing 3 perfectly ordinary things. 3 things that anyone listening would have taken for nothing more than the slightly unfortunate morning of a busy man. First, he called the council office and said he had been running a fever since the night before, and that the meeting would be postponed for 2 days. He delivered the words with just enough roughness in his voice, but not too much, and he knew that within 20 minutes the news would reach Warren Pike, and Warren Pike would have to swallow it without being allowed to question a single word, because to question it would be to admit that he had known in advance Emmett wasn't supposed to survive long enough to attend that morning's meeting. Second, he dialed Rafferty Doyle's number, and when the man answered, Emmett spoke exactly one word, an old piece of dock worker slang his father had taught him when he was 15, and which only 3 people in the entire city still understood. Rafferty didn't ask why. He simply said yes, and ended the call, and within an hour, he would vanish from the map, from every telephone number, and from the reach of anyone who might want to find him. Third, Emmett called the kitchen and canceled lunch. Then he set down the receiver, sat across from Ruth again, and asked her a question none of his advisors had been able to answer in 9 years, a question whose answer couldn't be purchased by an entire network of people, money, and favors stretching across 4 states. "Over the past 3 months," he said, "what has she changed in this house?" Ruth raised her head. She understood immediately what he was asking, and that was precisely what sent a chill through Emmett, because her immediate understanding meant she had known for a long time. She was silent for a moment as she arranged the details in her mind, then began slowly, in chronological order, as though reading back a list of tasks. 3 weeks earlier, Beatrice had moved her things into the eastern guest room, saying that he snored and she couldn't sleep. Emmett said nothing, but he knew, and Ruth knew as well because she cleaned both rooms, that he had never snored once in his life. Before that, Beatrice had begun telling her to take down the photographs, not all at once, one each week. The engagement photographs taken in Charleston, by the shore, beneath that veranda heavy with climbing vines, had hung along the second-floor hallway for an entire year. Every week, Ruth removed one photograph and replaced it with a still life taken from storage, and whenever she asked why, Beatrice gave the same answer, that the light in the hallway didn't suit the new frames. By the 9th week, there wasn't a single photograph left in the hallway, and no one in the house had noticed, including the man who walked through it twice every day. Then she forbade the kitchen from preparing smoked catfish. She said the smell made her nauseated. Emmett had eaten that dish 3 times a week for 10 years. His father had eaten it 3 times a week before him. It was the only dish in that house prepared from a recipe no one had ever written down. And 6 weeks earlier, Beatrice had gone into the garden one morning, stood in the western corner for half a minute, then called Ruth over and told her to tear out the entire flower bed there. Ruth had questioned her once. Beatrice said it disrupted the composition of the garden. Emmett said nothing. He rose from his chair, walked 3 steps to the small window at the base of the cellar wall, a window level with the ground through which only a strip of grass and a patch of bare soil could be seen. He stood there for a long time. He had planted that flower bed himself at 19, 3 months after his father's funeral, using 2 hands that didn't yet know what to do with themselves, during a summer when he hadn't slept through a single night. He had planted it because his mother loved those flowers, and she had died 4 years before his father. He had never told anyone that story. He had never told Beatrice what the flower bed meant either, because he had believed there were certain things people came to understand on their own after living beside them long enough. He didn't say a word about the flowers. He returned to the table and sat down, but inside his mind, those small pieces began arranging themselves, and the shape they formed made him feel more sick than the 90 seconds on the recording ever had. Because a recording was a moment. This was 3 months. A woman had stopped loving him 3 months earlier, and she hadn't hidden it. She had done it openly, in the middle of his own house, through 100 small signs scattered along the path he walked every day. She had moved out of his bed. She had taken his face down from the walls. She had removed his food from the kitchen. She had torn his mother's flowers out of the earth. And throughout those 3 months, the only man in that house who had seen nothing at all was Emmett himself, because he had been too busy walking through his own rooms with his head lowered over his phone, too busy being the man other men were supposed to fear. A person doesn't lose a love in a single day. They lose it across 100 mornings, when no one bothers to lift their head and look. Ruth rose to get him a glass of water from the old faucet in the corner of the room, and when she came back down the final step of the cellar stairs, her left leg hesitated for half a beat before touching the floor. This time, Emmett saw it. She set the glass of water on the table and sat down, and because he didn't ask, she answered the question before it could remain suspended in the room. 6 years ago, a fire. It healed, but it never straightened properly. She didn't offer another word. She didn't say where the fire had happened, whose house had burned, or what she had been doing there. And Emmett Halloran, a man who made a habit of asking questions until he knew everything about everyone sitting across from him, didn't ask anything more. He only nodded once and took a sip of water. Then he pointed to the recorder, still lying in the middle of the table. "You said this machine is always running. I want to understand why anyone would leave a recorder on for 8 hours every day." Ruth picked it up, turned it over in her hands, and for the first time that morning, her face softened slightly. "My brother developed severe meningitis after inhaling smoke during the fire when he was 20, Ruth said. He spent 11 days in the hospital. When he came home, he couldn't hear anymore. Not at all. The doctors said there was nothing else they could do," she continued, and there wasn't a trace of pity in her voice, because pity was something meant for other people, not for Nolan. He was 26 now and restored wooden furniture for a living, repairing chairs and cabinets that other people had planned to throw away. He lived alone in a 3rd-floor apartment, bought his own groceries, cooked his own meals, found his own work, and made his own deliveries. And he was proud of that in the way a man can only be proud of something he has had to wrestle back from the hands of fate. He could read lips so well that some customers spoke with him for an entire afternoon without ever realizing he couldn't hear them. But there was one thing he couldn't do, and that was make a telephone call. So every night, I type out the list of everything I did that day and send it to him in a message, Ruth said. This morning I trimmed the southern hedge. At noon I cleaned the greenhouse glass. In the afternoon I changed the soil in the pots on the veranda. Little things like that. But he likes knowing how my day went. He says it makes him feel as though he's still part of my day. She placed the recorder back on the table. Speaking into the machine is faster than trying to remember everything while I work. So I switch it on when I walk through the gate, and I switch it off when I leave. Emmett studied the cheap recorder for a long time. Then he reached inside his suit jacket, withdrew a thin black card, and placed it on the wooden table, turning it toward her. He named a number. It was more than Ruth Delacroix had earned in the past 6 years combined, and he said it in the voice of a man reading a train schedule. Take it. This isn't repayment. I don't repay anyone. It's so you'll have somewhere else to stand before things get worse. Ruth looked at the card. Then she raised 2 fingers and pushed it back across the wood toward him. Sir, you're misunderstanding my problem, she said. I'm not short of a sum of money. I'm being crushed by a debt. She explained it briefly and clearly, as though she had already been forced to explain the same thing many times across other tables where someone sat on the opposite side and looked at her as though she were nothing more than a file. Her family's old medical debt, the debt that had begun 6 years earlier and had never stopped growing, was now in the hands of a collection agency. And what they needed from her wasn't a pile of money falling out of the sky. They needed a stable income recorded on paper, the same amount month after month, with an employer, a signature, and an official stamp. If an amount like the one you just named suddenly appears in my account and I can't explain where it came from, she said, I won't be paying off my debt. I'll only be creating another problem for myself. And this time it'll be the kind of problem that causes them to put my brother's case under review. I haven't allowed that to happen once in 6 years. Emmett picked up the card and returned it to his pocket. He didn't argue. In 9 years of sitting at the head of the table, he had learned to recognize the difference between someone refusing in order to bargain and someone refusing because the answer was final. But there was still one question he hadn't asked, and he asked it now. Why did you risk your life for me? My business isn't your business. You could have let me get into that car. You could have pretended you heard nothing yesterday. No one in this world would ever have known. Ruth remained silent for a long time, long enough for Emmett to believe she wasn't going to answer. Then she raised her eyes. My mother tended gardens for other people, she said. She told me that when you see a root growing in the wrong direction and choose to ignore it, it doesn't go away on its own. It keeps growing. Then, years later, it breaks the foundation of your house. She looked directly at him. Sir, I've already lived inside a house that collapsed once. I can't do it a second time. For the first time in 12 years, Emmett Halloran sat across from someone who wanted nothing from him. And somehow, that felt even stranger than betrayal. Sheldon Barrow arrived 17 minutes earlier than he had promised. He descended the narrow staircase slowly, one breath for every step. 71 years old, and with one lung working at only half its strength. And when he entered the stone room, he didn't embrace Emmett, didn't ask whether he was all right, and didn't say a single word about the past 20 months. He set his canvas bag beside the table, removed his coat, and looked at Ruth Delacroix for exactly 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds lasted longer than politeness allowed, and Ruth let him look, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes refusing to turn away. Who is she? Sheldon asked, and he asked Emmett, not Ruth. She's the reason I'm still standing here, Emmett said. Sheldon nodded once. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down, and from that moment forward, he never looked at Ruth again in the way one looks at a stranger. Before you speak, the old man said, placing his right hand, missing 2 finger joints, on the table. Let me finish this first. I left because of my lungs, not because of you. The doctor told me to get out of this city if I still wanted to breathe. So don't apologize to me, don't thank me, and don't waste a single minute on it. Tell me. Emmett told him. He spoke for 15 minutes without adding a single adjective, exactly as his father had taught him to present a bad situation, beginning with the running shoes beneath the suit trousers, and ending at the point where 90 seconds dissolved into static. Sheldon listened to everything without interrupting or asking a question. When Emmett finished, the old man remained silent for a while, staring at the lamp on the table. Then he spoke slowly, in the voice of someone taking something from a drawer that had been closed for a very long time. Your father had a saying he repeated to me 3 times in 30 years. Only 3 times. And every time he was right. He turned his eyes toward Emmett. 1 enemy inside the house is worth 10 enemies in the street. The enemy outside has to break down the door to get in. But the enemy inside is already sitting at the dinner table, and the only way to bring that enemy down isn't to strike. He paused. It's to let them believe they're winning. Emmett nodded. He already knew the saying. He only needed to hear someone speak it aloud in that room, so it could become a decision instead of a thought. Then they began discussing the work ahead, and the first matter wasn't Warren Pike. The first matter was a 26-year-old man in a 3rd-floor apartment across the city whose existence no one in that estate had known about until now. Sheldon listened as Ruth told him about Nolan and about Odessa Vance, the 68-year-old woman in the apartment across the hall, a retired nurse who had shared tea with Ruth's brother every afternoon for 6 years. The old man asked exactly 4 questions. How many exits the apartment had, how many doors there were in the building, who kept the spare key, and whether Nolan accepted work from strangers. Ruth answered each one. Then Sheldon rose, walked to the corner of the room, and made 2 very brief telephone calls to 2 men who didn't work in that house and had never set foot on the estate. 2 men who belonged to him alone from the old years. That night, Nolan Delacroix and Odessa Vance left the building through the rear entrance, climbed into an unmarked car, and traveled 3 hours south to a wooden house on St. Simon's Island, where a porch overlooked the sea and a small workshop behind the house still held the complete set of tools left by its former owner. Ruth typed a long message to her brother before he entered the car, and she wrote exactly as much of the truth as he needed to know, that she had work to do for her employer for several days, that she wanted him to spend some time by the sea because the air there would be good for his craft, and that Odessa would be going with him. Nolan typed back one line. "Remember to eat dinner. Don't skip it like you did last week." Ruth read it twice, then slipped the phone into her apron pocket. Across the entire Halloran estate, not one person knew that the gardener had a younger brother, and the next 3 days began the following morning. For those 3 days, Emmett Halloran lived with two faces. During the day, he was a man preparing to marry. He came down to breakfast at the usual hour. He kissed Beatrice's temple as he passed her chair. He discussed the weather at the end of the month, the spring trip they had been talking about since the previous year, and an old friend whose child had just been born. He nodded to Warren Pike in the hallway and asked him about an investment in Charleston, and Warren answered in that same steady voice, and Emmett listened to every word without allowing a single muscle in his face to betray him. At night, after 12 o'clock, he passed through the tool shed and descended into the stone room, and there he became an entirely different man, a man arranging every piece on a board his opponent didn't yet know existed, and he had to perform both roles perfectly, because in this game, the man who failed to play his part was the man who died first. At 8 o'clock that evening, dinner was served in the smaller dining room, the one with windows overlooking the private garden. Beatrice came down 7 minutes late, wearing a black dress and the strand of pearls he had bought for her in New Orleans 3 years earlier, and she paused in the doorway to smile at him exactly as she had smiled on 1,000 evenings before. Emmett rose and pulled out her chair. She brushed a kiss against the air beside his cheek and sat down. "You're home earlier than usual," she said, unfolding her napkin across her lap. "You've never postponed a council meeting. Not in 5 years. Everything has a first time." She lifted her wineglass and studied him over the rim, and Emmett realized there was no warmth in her gaze. It was measuring him, calculating whether there was a crack in her plan, and if there was, how wide it might be. In 12 years, he had looked into those eyes tens of thousands of times, and had never once seen them doing this. "You look tired," she said. "Are you all right?" And he answered with the one sentence in the world she couldn't answer in return. "I've been thinking about my father." The knife in Beatrice's hand stopped in midair for half a beat. Only half a beat, and then it lowered to the plate, and continued as though nothing had happened. But Emmett saw it, because tonight he was sitting at that table with another man's eyes. His father had died 15 years earlier, on a street 4 blocks away. Killed by a bomb planted beneath his car by the very advisor who had sat beside the old man for 11 years. Emmett had never told Beatrice that story, not because he was hiding it, but because he told it to no one, and she had learned long ago that it was the only door inside this man she wasn't permitted to knock upon. She placed her knife along the edge of the plate, wiped her fingers on her napkin, and chose her voice very carefully. "You rarely speak of him, because some things don't need to be spoken." Emmett lifted his water glass, took a sip, and set it down. "And some betrayals become louder when people remain silent." Beatrice gave a brief laugh, thin and quick. "You're very philosophical tonight." Then she changed the subject, and it was the way she changed it that sent a chill down his spine. She said it lightly, while turning the plate of vegetables toward herself, as casually as though she were commenting on the furniture. "Oh, the gardener girl didn't trim the western hedge today. Did you give her the day off?" Emmett didn't lift his eyes from his plate. "I didn't notice." "Well," she said, "I suppose you truly didn't." And then she moved on to the spring trip, and they spoke about it for another 15 minutes, like two ordinary people, and Emmett answered in the right places, laughed in the right places, and asked the right questions. But inside his mind, a door had just closed very softly, because in 12 years of living in that house, Beatrice Ashford had never, not once, cared whether the western hedge had been trimmed. She didn't know the name of the person who swept the courtyard. She didn't know who cleaned the second-floor windows. She called every one of them by the same words, girl or boy, and she couldn't tell one from another. Yet tonight, on this particular night, she knew exactly which hedge hadn't been trimmed and who was supposed to have trimmed it. Dinner ended at 9 o'clock. At the dining room door, Beatrice rose onto her toes and kissed his forehead, exactly as she had done every evening for 12 years. then stepped back and looked at him for one more second. "Sleep well, darling. Sleep well." He remained alone in the hallway after the sound of her footsteps had faded at the top of the stairs. On the wall beside him hung a still life of a vase filled with flowers, placed exactly where, 10 weeks earlier, there had been a photograph of the two of them in Charleston. He walked to the large mirror at the end of the hallway, looked into it, and saw a faint mark of lipstick on his forehead. He raised the back of his hand and wiped it away slowly until his skin was completely clean. Tomorrow, he would have to let her kiss him again. The day after that as well. She hadn't asked about the gardener out of curiosity. She was counting the people inside the house, and he knew it. While dinner was being served upstairs, 2 floors below, Sheldon Barrow sat in the stone room with a laptop, a worn leather-bound notebook, and the satellite phone resting beside his elbow. He worked through the night. He made 4 calls to 4 men in 3 different states, men whose names appeared on no Halloran family list and who had never received a single dollar from it. One had once been an auditor. Another had worked at a small private bank in Atlanta and now grew pecans. All 4 men owed Sheldon Barrow something money couldn't buy, and all 4 answered their phones at midnight without asking why. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the shape of it had begun to emerge across the pages of the notebook. Over the previous 90 days, $4 million had left a family account, not all at once, but in a slow drip through 11 separate transfers, each one below the reporting threshold, each one carrying a legitimate purpose code. The money had passed through a consulting company in Delaware that existed only on paper, then through a shipping company in Panama that also existed only on paper, before disappearing into an account in Belize that no one could trace any farther. Up to that point, it was all technique, and Sheldon had seen this kind of thing many times in his life. But one detail made him put down his pen and sit upright. All 11 transfers had passed through the same internal approval process, the process reserved for major operating expenses, the process that only a handful of people in the entire house had the authority to sign. Sheldon turned the page, wrote 3 words, and underlined them. He hadn't identified the signature yet. The system that stored approval signatures was housed on a server in the city office, and touching it now would be the same as firing a flare into the sky. He circled the note and left it there. But what he discovered at 4 o'clock in the morning couldn't wait until daylight. He had been cross-checking the vehicle schedules from 3 days earlier, a task that should have taken no more than 10 minutes, when he stopped at one line. He read it 3 times. Then he stood, went upstairs, and knocked on the door of Emmett's private study at 10 minutes past 4 in the morning. Emmett was still awake. Sheldon placed the laptop on the desk, turned the screen toward him, and said nothing for 3 seconds, allowing the other man to read it for himself. "Rafferty Doyle was never sick," he said at last. On the screen was an internal message sent at 10:40 on Monday night, 9 hours before Emmett had stepped onto the stone portico. Its contents were brief and entirely ordinary. Rafferty had been reassigned to Charleston to receive a shipment, leaving immediately during the night. No need to report back. Another man would handle the car on Tuesday morning. Beneath the message was Emmett Halloran's digital signature. Emmett stared at the screen for a long time. He said nothing. He only looked at his own name resting there, neat, valid, authenticated by the system, beneath an order he had never given. "You didn't send this," Sheldon said. It wasn't a question. "I didn't send this." Sheldon sat down, and the old man's voice dropped very low, the voice people use when they must say aloud what both of them already understand, but neither has been willing to speak. "Then he hasn't merely bought your people. He's inside your system. He can issue orders under your name, and if he can write them, he can read them." A long silence settled over the room. Emmett Halloran sat motionless, and in those 30 seconds, the previous 3 days replayed inside his mind from an entirely different direction. The call postponing the council meeting. Warren had read it before the office had even had time to pass the news along. The call to Rafferty, the old piece of dockworker slang Emmett had believed only 3 people in the world still understood, but Warren hadn't needed to understand what the word meant. He only needed to know that a call had been placed, and that Emmett's personal driver had vanished from the map immediately afterward. The call to Sheldon Barrow from the satellite phone, the one call Emmett had believed was clean, but the house's landline number was inside the system, and every incoming and outgoing call left a line in the log. The canceled lunch, the room being prepared, the unmarked car leaving through the service gate at 11 o'clock at night. Everything he had done over the past 3 days, every move he had believed he was concealing, had already been laid neatly across his enemy's desk before Emmett had even lowered the receiver. He had carefully closed the door and spoken softly inside a house where every wall was listening. Emmett rose, walked to the window, and stood there looking out over the dark courtyard. Then he spoke one sentence, and he wasn't speaking to Sheldon. He was speaking to the darkness outside. Then he chose to let me live these 3 days. He paused, deliberately. Sheldon didn't ask him to explain. The old man understood at once. And he understood that this was the most frightening part of all. A man who misses his strike has to run. A man who misses his strike and still allows his prey to move freely for 3 days isn't a man who missed. He is a man waiting for something else. For 3 days, Emmett Halloran had believed he was performing in front of his enemy. For those same 3 days, the enemy had been sitting in the audience, applauding. The following night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 knocks sounded at the servants' entrance behind the kitchen, and Hollis Trent stepped inside. He was 58 years old, with shoulders as broad as a door and hands so large that the leather bag he carried looked small inside them. He was the longest-serving man in the house, the only one remaining from Emmett's father's time, the man the old patriarch himself had chosen 30 years earlier and had never needed to replace. He followed Sheldon down into the stone room, ducking beneath the low doorway, and greeted no one. He placed the leather bag on the wooden table, pulled open the zipper, and spread it wide. Inside was cash, bundled into stacks, and arranged neatly in 2 rows. Emmett didn't look at the bag. He looked at Hollis's face. "Warren brought this to my kitchen 10 weeks ago," Hollis said. His voice was deep and slow, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this sentence many times in his mind, and now only needed to release it. "He sat at my kitchen table, finished a cup of coffee, then set this bag down, and said that when the transition came, the advisor's chair would be mine." He paused. He didn't say what the transition was. He didn't need to. At my age, when a man uses that word in your kitchen at 10 o'clock at night, you understand exactly what transition means. He didn't sit down. He remained standing at the end of the table, his arms hanging at his sides. "I took it," he said. "I took it because if I had pushed the bag back toward him, he would have known. And if he had known, I wouldn't have survived that week. You know I'm right." Emmett didn't answer. "But I haven't spent a single dollar," Hollis said. "Not one. It has been sitting in a cabinet in my house for 10 weeks, and I haven't opened it once. It was never mine. It was always yours." Silence held the room for a while. Sheldon Barrow, seated at the corner of the table with his worn, leather-bound notebook, raised his eyes to the man standing there and spoke softly, almost to himself. "Your father would be proud tonight." Hollis didn't turn toward him. He only gave a slight nod, like a man who had just been forgiven a debt he had carried for 10 weeks. Emmett rose, walked around the table, and placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. It was a gesture he hadn't offered anyone in the previous 3 days. "Go home and rest for 3 hours, he said. "Then come back tomorrow morning. I need you here." That was the moment everything in the house began moving in a different direction. Over the next 2 days, 4 captains were called back, one at a time, none arriving with another, all entering through the servants' door after midnight. All 4 had served the family since Emmett's father was alive. They sat around the wooden table in the stone room and listened as Emmett laid out everything, and not one of them asked more than 2 questions. Hollis Trent sat at the end of the table across from Emmett. He sat with his back straight, his enormous hands resting before him, and he listened. He listened to the 90 seconds on the recording. He listened to the running shoes beneath the suit trousers. He listened to the $4 million moving through Delaware and Panama before disappearing in Belize. He listened to the forged message sent at 10:40 on Monday night, and to the fact that Warren Pike could read everything inside the house's communication system. He heard it all. He didn't miss a single word. From time to time, he asked a brief question, and every question landed exactly where it should, the kind of question only a man with 30 years of experience would know to ask. Near dawn, after everyone had gone upstairs, Sheldon Barrow remained alone and began returning the money to the bag so it could be placed in the safe. He worked slowly, because his right hand was missing 2 finger joints, and he had to use both hands for every stack. When he lifted the 4th bundle, he noticed something in passing. Tucked beneath the paper band was a faint purple ink stamp from a private offshore bank in Belize, the exact same bank where the missing $4 million had vanished 3 weeks prior. He stopped for perhaps 2 seconds. Hollis had claimed this money sat in his cabinet for 10 weeks, but this stamp proved it was drawn from the betrayal fund less than 20 days ago. Sheldon placed the bundle into the bag with the others, pulled the zipper closed, and stood. He was 71 years old. He had been awake for 2 nights without sleep, and one of his lungs was working at only half its strength. He said nothing to anyone yet, knowing he needed to cross-check the transfer records first, before confronting a man who had stood beside the family for 30 years. In a house that is burning, the person carrying in the water is always the one least likely to be suspected. The following morning, inside the stone room, everything came to a stop against a wall. They had 90 seconds of broken recording. They had $4 million moving through 3 countries before disappearing. They had a forged message bearing the digital signature of the master of the house himself. But they didn't have a single name beyond the 2 names already inside that house. And both of those people knew how to survive a council hearing, when all that could be placed on the table was an old recording and a single line from a system log. Hollis Trent said it plainly. None of the evidence would hold. The 4 captains sat in silence. Sheldon turned the pages of his notebook back and forth and found nothing new. Emmett stood against the wall with his arms folded across his chest and said nothing for 10 minutes. Then a voice rose from the place no one had been paying much attention to, from the chair at the far end of the table where Ruth Delacroix had been sitting quietly since the meeting began. "There are cameras in the garden," she said. Everyone in the room turned toward her. The camera mounted on the eastern wall, beside the flower trellis. "It covers the entire path and part of the courtyard," she continued slowly, in the manner of someone who had spent the whole night thinking about this and wanted to say it correctly. "It doesn't point directly at the fountain, but it's a high-definition security camera pointing straight at the greenhouse's dark, mirrored glass panel. Their reflections were captured with crystal clarity against the morning sunlight." Sheldon Barrow shook his head almost immediately. "Miss, I understand what you mean, but the garden cameras don't record sound. They never have. A reflection without sound is no different from a photograph of 2 people standing and talking. It doesn't prove anything." "I know there's no sound," Ruth said. Then she raised her eyes to the old man. "My brother has been deaf for 6 years. He reads lips better than I can hear." Silence held the stone room for exactly 3 seconds. Then Emmett Halloran pushed away from the wall and walked toward the table. By that afternoon, the footage had been copied and sent through a private channel belonging to Sheldon, without passing through any system inside the house. 3 hours later, on St. Simon's Island, inside the wooden house with the porch overlooking the sea, Nolan Delacroix sat down in front of a computer screen while Odessa Vance pulled a chair beside him. The afternoon sunlight fell diagonally through the window and across the table. Odessa poured him a glass of iced tea and placed it beside his elbow, then put on her glasses so she could see clearly. The footage looked completely ordinary. A courtyard, a fountain, 2 people standing and talking. Nothing else, nothing more. Nolan watched it once from beginning to end, then rewound it and began to work. And he worked with such excitement that Odessa couldn't help smiling. For 6 years, this skill had been something he was forced to learn so the world couldn't shut him out. He had learned it during the hardest months of his life, sitting before a mirror and studying his own mouth, sitting in restaurants and watching the mouths of strangers, spending hour after hour with his sister practicing how to catch words that barely made a person's lips move. It was a skill he had learned through pain, and until now, it had served only one person, himself. Now, for the first time, it could help someone else. He typed the first message to his sister. "Wait for me. I can do this." He stopped the footage frame by frame. He enlarged the reflection in the glass, adjusted the contrast, tilted his head, and replayed the same second 7 or 8 times. Some sections were too blurred, so he left them blank and added a note. In other places, the man turned his back, and Nolan marked them as unreadable. But everything he could read, he typed out 1 sentence at a time, with the care of a craftsman repairing an antique chair, never daring to guess where he wasn't certain. After 4 hours, a transcript nearly 3 pages long was sent back to the stone room. Emmett read it first, then handed it to Sheldon, and Sheldon read it aloud to everyone around the table. The plan appeared in full, clean and complete, without a single link missing. Talmadge Bridge, the middle section. During the hours when 2 lanes were under repair, the car wouldn't go to the council meeting. It would be taken to an abandoned workshop by the river, where a man could be held for several days without anyone hearing a thing. 3 shell companies and an account in Nassau, a signature that had to be obtained. And if he refused to sign, there was still another method, slower but certain. The four captains listened without saying a word. Then Sheldon turned to the final page, and his voice slowed. Nolan had typed much more carefully in that section, and before transcribing it, he had added a note of his own. He wrote that he had watched the passage 11 times to make certain, because it was different from every other part. He wrote that the man hadn't said these words to the woman beside him. He had turned away, walked 3 steps from the fountain, raised a phone to his ear, and spoken into it. "You have nothing to worry about. In 2 weeks, that chair will be yours." Sheldon finished reading the line and lowered the page onto the table. No one in the stone room spoke. The lamp on the table gave a faint hum. The 4 captains sat motionless, and Emmett Halloran stood perfectly straight at the head of the table, both hands resting on the wood, staring down at 3 pages, typed by a 26-year-old man 3 hours away who had read the truth from a reflection in a pane of glass. Warren Pike wasn't the mastermind. Warren Pike was working for someone seated above him. On Friday night, Emmett Halloran sat before the computer in his second-floor study, opened the family's internal communications system, and typed a plan into it. He typed slowly and completely, following the proper format without leaving out a single detail. The fever had broken. The council meeting would take place at 9:30 on Saturday morning at the estate outside the city. He would leave the mansion at exactly 9 o'clock, take the familiar route across Talmadge Bridge, and require an escort vehicle to follow 3 minutes behind. He read it through once, corrected a comma, then pressed save and shut down the computer. He remained there for a while in the darkness of the room, staring at the blackened screen, knowing with absolute certainty that before daylight, someone would read every word he had just written. That was the entire purpose of it. Saturday morning dawned clear. At exactly 9 o'clock, the black car rolled through the main gates, precisely on time and following precisely the stated route. In the rear seat sat a man wearing Emmett Halloran's suit, the same height, the same breadth across the shoulders, his hair carrying the same shade of gray at the temples. He was a retired police officer, 60 years old, a man who hadn't feared the things other people feared for 30 years. And when Sheldon asked whether he would do it, the only question he asked in return was, what time? Warren Pike stood beside the car door, his hair combed back, a gray coat over his shoulders, both hands tucked into his pockets. He bent slightly when the door opened. "The meeting begins at 9:30, sir," he said in that steady voice, the voice of a man reporting an approved expense. The man in the suit nodded and settled into the rear seat. The door closed. The car passed through the gates and turned left. Warren Pike stood watching until it disappeared, then looked at his watch and went back inside. At 11 minutes past 9, the black car reached Talmadge Bridge. At 13 minutes past 9, on the middle section where 2 lanes were under repair, a cargo truck slowed and came to a complete stop across the road ahead. At the same moment, a second truck moved in behind them and sealed off the retreat. Brake lights flared red. Then, everything happened very quickly, and there wasn't much to see, only things to hear. Car doors opened in rapid succession. Footsteps struck the steel surface of the bridge, the sound rising, falling toward the river below, then returning again, making it impossible to know where it had begun. Men shouted, and those shouts came from 3 different voices in 3 different directions, overlapping before anyone could distinguish one from another. Several short explosions struck the sides of the bridge and vanished quickly into the river wind. Smoke rose, thin and white, swept sideways by the wind before disappearing within seconds. Then everything stopped, and the silence that followed lasted longer than anyone could bear, broken only by wind passing through the steel braces and the distant call of a ship's horn somewhere downriver. When the smoke had cleared completely, 4 men lay face down on the bridge with their hands behind their heads, and 2 others had already placed their weapons on the roadway before anyone had the chance to order them to do so. No one inside the black car had been injured. The retired police officer stepped out of the rear seat, unbuttoned Emmett Halloran's suit jacket, and lit a cigarette with a hand that didn't tremble. The false driver, the man wearing running shoes beneath his suit trousers, was pulled to his feet and leaned against the side of the bridge. He confessed in less than 2 minutes, and he gave exactly 2 names and 1 number. The first name was Warren Pike. The second was Beatrice Ashford. The number was 400,000. He repeated again and again that this was all he knew, that the people who hired him never said more than they needed to, and Hollis Trent, who stood listening to his confession, nodded and told his men to put him into the vehicle. But Emmett Halloran wasn't there. He wasn't inside the black car. He wasn't inside the escort vehicle, following 3 minutes behind. The vehicle clearly described in the plan, and the vehicle anyone who had read that plan would believe he was riding in. He hadn't taken a single step beyond the boundaries of his own estate. At 9 o'clock that morning, while the black car rolled through the gates, Emmett Halloran left his study, descended to the ground floor, crossed the hallway with the still life painting of the flower vase, and entered the smaller dining room, the one with windows overlooking the private garden. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. He took a glass from the cabinet and poured himself a little water. He placed the satellite phone on the table beside his right hand, its screen facing downward. Then he sat with his back straight, both hands resting on the wood, his face turned toward the door, and he waited. He wasn't waiting for a call from Talmadge Bridge. He had known since the night before how the events on the bridge would end, and however they ended, they weren't the most important matter of that morning. He was waiting for footsteps on the staircase. He was waiting for a woman to come down, cross the hallway, and enter that room carrying a bag, certain the house was empty. Some traps are built to catch a person who is running away. This trap was built to catch someone who was coming home. At 10:15, Emmett Halloran picked up the internal telephone and called for Ruth Delacroix to come down to the stone room. No one answered. He called the kitchen a second time. The cook said she hadn't eaten breakfast there. He called the greenhouse. No one picked up. He lowered the receiver, rose, and walked toward the door with a feeling he hadn't experienced inside that house in 18 years. The feeling of stepping into a familiar room and realizing that one object had been moved a few inches from where it belonged. The guard at the service gate gave his report with complete calm, even with a trace of satisfaction that he remembered the time so precisely. At 9:40 that morning, Captain Hollis Trent had brought one of the family vehicles through the service gate. He had said there were orders to take the gardener to a safer location outside the city, that the situation that morning was unstable, and that the car should be allowed to drive directly along the side entrance. The guard hadn't stopped him. The guard hadn't asked a question. No one on that estate questioned an order spoken by the longest-serving man in the house, the man the master's own father had personally chosen 30 years earlier. The vehicle left through the gate at 9:51. No one recorded the license plate because it belonged to the family. Emmett stood in the courtyard before the service gate and listened to everything. And he didn't ask a single question. He didn't ask whether she had walked to the car willingly. He didn't ask whether she had said anything. There are moments when a person needs no further details because the entire picture has already appeared, and every additional question is merely a way of delaying the moment when they must look at it. Sheldon Barrow returned from Talmadge Bridge at 10:30, and he entered the stone room wearing the face of a 71-year-old man who had broken a promise to himself. He had questioned 2 of his own men. He had made 3 calls. No one knew anything, and that was the answer. Emmett didn't speak a single word of blame to him. He only stood there in the center of the stone room, his arms hanging at his sides, and remained completely still for exactly 10 seconds. During those 10 seconds, no one in the room dared to move. Then he walked to the walnut cabinet against the wall, reached beneath the shelf, pressed the hidden latch, and the false panel sprang open. Inside was a small safe. He opened it and removed his father's revolver from its wrapping cloth. He broke open the cylinder, turned it once beneath the lamp, inspected every round, then snapped it shut with one clean, dry click. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, slid the weapon into the holster beneath his arm, and fastened every button again. He did all of it very slowly, without one unnecessary sound or one hurried movement, like a priest adjusting his stole before stepping out before the congregation. There were 8 men in the room, 4 loyal captains, 2 of Sheldon's men, the retired police officer who had just returned from the bridge, and Sheldon himself. Emmett turned and looked at every one of them. "She doesn't carry the Halloran name," he said. "She hasn't married anyone in this house. She owes me nothing, and I didn't buy her with a single dollar. 6 days ago, she could have let me step into that car and continued with her own life, and today no one in this room would still be sitting here." He paused. "But from this moment forward, she is family." No one spoke. "Anyone who hides a single word from me tonight loses his seat and loses his name with it. Whoever brings her home can name what he wants, and I'll pay it with anything I possess." He looked into each face. "And if anyone sitting in this room has chosen the other side, then understand this. Tonight, I'm no longer hunting for the traitor. I'm looking for one person. Don't stand in my way." All 8 men rose. Sheldon Barrow was the only one who stepped forward to face him. You can't leave this house, the old man said, his voice low and urgent. Emmett, listen to me. You are the target. Everything that happened this morning was meant to draw you out of this house. If you go out tonight, you'll be doing exactly what they spent 3 months arranging for you to do. Emmett looked at the old man for a long time. Then he asked one question, and he asked it very softly. Sheldon, if my father were alive, and the person who saved his life had been taken because they saved him, would he stay home tonight? Sheldon Barrow stood motionless. He had walked beside that man for 30 years. He had been there on the night the old patriarch walked into a neighborhood 4 men had warned him not to enter, and he had been there 19 years earlier when they carried the old man home. He knew the answer before the question was finished. He lowered his head. Never. Then don't ask me to do what my father wouldn't have done. Sheldon said nothing more. He turned toward the other 8 men and began assigning their duties, his old voice suddenly hard again, as it had been 30 years earlier, and within 15 minutes, the Halloran estate became something entirely different. 6 days ago, Emmett Halloran had been a man with nothing to lose. That was what had made the entire city fear him. Tonight, he was no longer that man, and he was dangerous in an entirely different way. At exactly 11 o'clock, the satellite phone on the wooden table began to vibrate. Emmett allowed it to ring 3 times before answering. Warren Pike's voice entered the stone room, as steady as ever, without a single rough edge to catch hold of. The voice of a man reading an entry from a balance sheet. 20 million. An account in the Cayman Islands. I'll send you the number within 3 minutes. 2 hours from now. No police, no captains, no vehicles. He paused for exactly 1 beat. Otherwise, you'll never find her again. Emmett didn't answer immediately. He allowed the silence to stretch long enough for the man on the other end to hear the sound of his own breathing. I can't produce 20 million in cash within 2 hours, he said. You know perfectly well no one can. Give me 12 hours. 6. And I want to hear her voice. Now. Otherwise, you and I have nothing more to discuss. There were footsteps on concrete at the other end of the line. There was the sound of something metal being pushed aside. Then came the sound of breathing, and then Ruth Delacroix's voice. Sir. She managed only that single word before Warren pulled the phone away. But in that one word, Emmett heard 3 things. She was still conscious. She wasn't crying, and behind her voice, very faintly, there was the sound of water striking something wooden, in a steady, measured rhythm. The sound of waves breaking against pilings, rather than water running from a pipe. The line went dead. 7 seconds. Sheldon Barrow spread a map of Savannah's Riverside Industrial District across the table. 4 locations had been circled in red. 4 abandoned factories standing along the stretch of land between the bridge and the mouth of the river, all owned by companies that had been dissolved, all less than 3 kilometers apart. Hollis Trent stood at the head of the table, his enormous hands planted along the edge of the map, and he spoke immediately, with the decisive voice of a man who had spent 30 years making decisions. Strike all 4 at once. 4 teams, the same hour. We don't have time to choose. Sheldon shook his head. No. He braced one hand against the table to support the weight of his own body. Mr. Trent, you know the terrain there as well as anyone. Those 4 buildings are less than 3 kilometers apart, and between them there's nothing but open ground and water. The noise from the first one will carry clearly to the other 3 within seconds. We won't even have time to open the first door. He looked directly at Hollis. We have only one chance. We need to know exactly which building it is. Emmett didn't take part in the argument. He picked up the phone and called St. Simon's Island. On the other end, Nolan Delacroix was seated at the table less than a minute after receiving his sister's message. He reopened the footage, reopened the 3 pages he had transcribed himself, and began watching from the beginning. This time, he wasn't searching for the plan. He was searching for the parts he had ignored the first time because they had seemed unimportant, the broken fragments of conversation between the 2 people beside the fountain, the things a transcriber would naturally leave out because they weren't part of the central content. After 40 minutes, he sent back 2 lines. The first said that the man had mentioned a blue metal roof and said it could be recognized immediately when seen from the bridge. The second said that the crane there hadn't turned in a long time, and that the man had said it with satisfaction, as though that fact alone was the reason he had chosen the place. Sheldon Barrow read the 2 lines, then lowered his eyes to the map. 3 of the 4 locations were dry goods warehouses. Only one had once been a ship repair yard, and only there, In a satellite image taken 11 months earlier, did an old crane still extend out over the water beside a row of corrugated metal roofs, faded to a dull greenish blue. No one in the stone room spoke, because Hollis Trent himself had reported the previous afternoon that his team had inspected that location. His exact words had been that the place was completely empty, that the doors were locked from the outside, that there were no tire marks, and that it wasn't worth wasting a man to watch it. Sheldon Barrow straightened. He didn't look at Hollis. He didn't say a word. He walked to the safe built into the wall, opened it, and removed the leather bag that had remained there since that night. He placed it on the table, opened the zipper, and took out one stack of money. He held it with both hands because his right hand was missing 2 finger joints. He placed it in the middle of the map beneath the light and turned it so everyone could see the underside of the paper band. He pointed a finger at the small purple mark. "Hollis told us this money sat in his house for 10 weeks, Sheldon said, his voice cold and steady. "But this stamp belongs to the private bank in Belize that opened 3 weeks ago. This money didn't come to him 10 weeks ago as a bribe he refused to spend. It was paid to him 3 weeks ago as an advance for helping Warren and Beatrice." Then Sheldon pulled the financial records toward himself. He turned to the page containing the 11 transactions, the internal approval process that only a handful of people in the house had the authority to sign, the box he had circled 3 nights earlier and left unfinished because he had been too exhausted. He had completed the search that morning and had intended to speak about it that afternoon. He opened to the exact page. Then he turned the papers 180 degrees across the table, pushed them toward Emmett Halloran, and took 1 step backward. The man who brought the bag back hadn't come to redeem himself. He had come so he could stand inside this room and hear everything we said. At exactly 10:40 that night, there was no moon, and the Savannah River lay black and heavy, like a strip of asphalt flowing slowly through the darkness. Rafferty Doyle drove the armored vehicle at the front. He had returned at 4 o'clock that afternoon. No one had called him. No one had sent word. And when he walked into the stone room, no one asked how he had known it was time to come back. He said only one sentence, that in 10 years, you had never once allowed me to switch off my phone, so I assumed you wouldn't want to drive yourself tonight. Then he sat down and waited. 3 vehicles left the estate at exactly 10 o'clock, traveling separately and approaching from 3 different directions. The ship repair yard stood at the end of a dead-end road. Its corrugated metal roof faded to a dull greenish blue. The old crane jutting out over the water like a broken arm that had been abandoned there for 9 years. From the outside, it looked completely empty, exactly as the report had said. The doors were locked from the outside. There were no tire tracks, but at the rear, close to the water's edge, there was a small steel door whose hinges gleamed with fresh grease, while everything around them had been rusting for 9 years. All 3 teams entered at the same moment. Emmett Halloran went in with the 3rd team, descending to the lower level by the iron staircase along the side of the building, and there was more to hear than to see. The sound of a steel door being forced inward, the sound of footsteps on damp concrete, many footsteps overlapping, then spreading apart, a voice shouting from the north side, another answering from the storage area, 2 brief sounds from the upper floor, less than a second apart, and then silence. After that came a long stillness, and within it there was nothing but the river striking the wooden pilings beneath the floor, steady and measured, the same sound Emmett had heard for 7 seconds over the telephone at 11 o'clock that morning. He reached the bottom of the staircase and pushed open the final door. The basement was broad, with a low ceiling and a single light bulb hanging from a cord in the center of the room. Ruth Delacroix sat in an iron chair placed directly beneath it, both wrists tied to the sides, one cheek swollen and dark with bruising. She had been sitting there for 13 hours, and she saw him before he had the chance to see her, because for all 13 of those hours, she had kept her eyes fixed on that door and hadn't looked away once. There were 3 other people in the room. Warren Pike stood on the left beside a folding table, holding a telephone and a stack of papers, his arms hanging at his sides, his thin framed glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. Hollis Trent stood on the right, his shoulders as broad as a door, his face carrying the calm expression of a man who hadn't needed to explain himself to anyone in 30 years. And the 3rd person stood in the middle, Beatrice Ashford. She wasn't standing beside Warren. She wasn't standing beside Hollis. She stood alone in the open space between them, about 3 steps from the iron chair, her coat still resting on her shoulders and her travel bag lying at her feet on the concrete floor. And that was the one thing no one in the room had expected, not even Hollis Trent. That morning, after leaving the dining room, Beatrice hadn't gone to the airport. She had gone looking for the answer she herself had refused to give. She had traveled to this place once with Warren Pike, 8 weeks earlier, and she remembered the way. She arrived at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and during the 3 hours she spent listening to the two men talking in the next room, she finally understood what she should have understood months before. There was no place in this plan where she survived. There was no place where Warren survived either. They were the perfect two names to carry all the blame. The treacherous fiancé and the greedy advisor, a story that practically wrote itself, a story the entire city would believe at once because it was so easy to believe. And once those two names disappeared from the picture, only one man would remain untouched, the longest-serving man in the house, the man the master's own father had personally chosen, sitting at the head of that long walnut table. She had spent 12 years being used as the background for one man, and that morning she had discovered that even in betrayal, she was still nothing more than the background for another. Hollis Trent saw Emmett standing in the doorway. He didn't panic. He only turned toward Beatrice and spoke in the warm voice he had used with everyone in that house for 30 years. The voice of an uncle, an elder, the man who always had a piece of advice ready. "Step back, Beatrice. This no longer concerns you." Beatrice looked at Emmett, seeing for the first time in 12 years not the powerful master of the house, but the man who had loved her without question. She realized that while she had spent her life being a pawn for powerful men, this was her only chance to reclaim her own soul. Looking at the cold barrel of Hollis's gun pointed at the helpless gardener, Beatrice saw her entire life reflected in that iron chair used, manipulated, and marked for disposal. For the first time in 12 years, fear gave way to a burning rage, and Beatrice Ashford stepped forward. She took exactly 2 steps and stopped between that man and the iron chair. She didn't look at Emmett. She looked at Hollis Trent. "For 12 years, I stood beside someone else," she said. Her voice was perfectly calm, calmer than anything she had said in the dining room that morning. "Beside them, behind them, to the right, wherever they needed me to stand. Not once in those 12 years was I allowed to choose where I stood." She didn't step back. "This time, I choose." Hollis Trent raised his weapon and fired before anyone could move. A single gunshot shattered the damp air, and then came a silence that lasted far longer than silence should. And within it, there was only the river striking the wooden pilings beneath the floor. Then footsteps came running across the concrete from several directions at once, followed by shouts and the sound of metal falling. Emmett Halloran crossed the room and dropped to his knees beside her. He lifted her head from the cold concrete and rested it in the crook of his arm. Beatrice opened her eyes and looked at him, and in that moment, there was something very young in her face. Something belonging to the year she was 20 and standing inside a small gallery on Bull Street. She spoke her final words so softly that only he could hear them. "Don't tell anyone I did this." She released a breath. "I don't want to be remembered as a good person. I'm not a good person, Emmett. Just remember that I was there." He remained still for a very long time after her hand had grown heavy inside his. Then he lowered her carefully to the floor and stood. Hollis Trent and Warren Pike were taken from the building, both alive, both walking on their own feet. That was the order Emmett had given before leaving the estate that night, and not one of his men disobeyed it. Both men would sit before the family council, and they would remain there for a very long time, and they would be questioned one by one, name by name, dollar by dollar. Emmett returned to the iron chair. He drew his knife, cut the ropes from Ruth's wrists, removed his coat, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Her hands were freezing and could no longer close. She looked at him, and the first thing she said wasn't about herself. "Nolan. He's somewhere with sunlight," Emmett said. "He's safe. Odessa is with him." He helped her rise from the chair. "And listen to me. He's the one who found this place. Not me. Not Sheldon. Not one of the 8 men outside. Your brother saw a greenish-blue metal roof and a crane that no longer turned, and he remembered them when every one of us had overlooked them." Ruth Delacroix began to cry for the first time in 13 hours, and she cried not because of her swollen cheek, not because of the iron chair, but because in 6 years, no one had ever spoken about her brother that way. Behind them, someone spread a blanket over the woman lying in the middle of the concrete floor. She had waited 12 years for someone to choose her. In the end, the person who chose her was Beatrice herself. The family's private clinic stood on a quiet street at the edge of the city, with no sign at the gate and no name on the door. It had treated Emmett's father twice, Sheldon Barrow once, and more than a dozen men who preferred that certain wounds never appear in any record. Ruth Delacroix slept for 14 hours. Emmett Halloran didn't leave the room once. He drank 3 cups of coffee that had gone completely cold, all of them taken from the small machine at the end of the hallway. He sat in the chair beside the window, with a medical report in one hand and a pen with which he didn't write a single word. He read the report 4 times, and every time, he couldn't remember what he had just read. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she did wasn't thank him. She didn't ask what time it was or what had finally happened. She lay still, staring at the ceiling for so long that Emmett thought she might fall asleep again. Then she spoke, her voice hoarse but clear. "I didn't apply for work at your house by accident." Emmett lowered the report onto his lap. Ruth continued looking at the ceiling. "The apartment building that burned 6 years ago, the building where my parents lived, the building where I dragged my brother outside and broke my leg," she said. 6 months after the fire, the entire property was sold. The buyer was a real estate company, and 3 years later, that company came under the control of the Halloran family. She swallowed once. Before the fire, that building had been cited for fire safety violations 3 times. 3 times. I know because I went to every survivor from that building and asked them myself. It took me a year and a half to speak to all of them. But when I went looking for those records, they were gone. They weren't at the fire department. They weren't at the courthouse. They weren't anywhere. Someone buried them. She turned her head and looked at him for the first time. "It took me 2 years to find a way onto your estate, sir. 3 jobs to keep my records spotless, a name no one would remember. I applied there 4 times in 2 years, and the first 3 applications were rejected. I learned how to prune ornamental plants in the evening so that my resume would hold up." Emmett Halloran said nothing. "I came there to find those records," Ruth said, "and I came there to destroy you." Beyond the window, a car passed very slowly, then its sound faded away completely. "Then the day before yesterday, I was cleaning the greenhouse glass, and I heard them planning to kill you." She fell silent for a moment, "And I discovered something I still haven't been able to say to anyone. I could have stood still. All I had to do was nothing. I didn't have to lie to anyone, hurt anyone, or make a sound. I only had to keep walking toward the greenhouse and continue with my work. And by that afternoon, everything I had wanted for 6 years would have happened on its own. No one in the world would ever have known, not even you." She looked directly at him. "I stood still on those steps for exactly 4 seconds that day, sir." She released a breath. "Then I ran after you." Emmett Halloran remained silent for a very long time. Then he placed the medical report on the small table, rose, and walked to the window. He stood with his back to her, both hands clasped behind him, and began to speak. He said the fire had happened in September, 6 years and 2 months earlier. He said he had taken full authority over the estate's real estate acquisitions 6 years ago, when he turned 28, stepping in after his uncle's passing to consolidate the empire he had inherited 15 years earlier. He said the order to acquire that real estate company had been signed before he took his place at the head of the table, that the fire safety records had been handled by someone inside the family, and that during the previous night, while she slept, he had ordered the entire archive from those 7 years reopened and every signature examined. Then he turned around. "The man who signed the order to purchase that building was Hollis Trent," he said. "The man who handled the records was Hollis Trent. The man who removed them from the department and buried them was also Hollis Trent." He paused, "And during the final week of my father's life, 15 years ago, the man closest to him, the man who drove him, the man who knew which route he would take and where he would stop, was Hollis Trent as well." No one spoke inside the small hospital room for a very long time. Ruth Delacroix lay in the bed with the intravenous needle still in her left hand, looking at the man standing beside the window, and both of them understood something neither wanted to say aloud first. The same man had taken her parents from her and had taken his father from him. The same man had sat inside the same house and smiled at both of them. "So for 6 years," Ruth said softly, "we were searching for the same man, from opposite ends of the city, and neither of us knew the other existed. 3 weeks later, the family council met in the room with the long walnut table. Hollis Trent and Warren Pike walked into that room, and neither of them walked out. They were questioned name by name, dollar by dollar, night by night, for almost 4 hours, and what followed belonged to a law older than every court in the state of Georgia. The next day, the fire safety violation records for the apartment building on Bay Street were removed from storage, copied in full, and delivered to a law firm chosen by Ruth Delacroix herself, not one connected to the family, and not one that knew anyone inside that house. Emmett didn't offer a single word of advice about the choice. He only asked how much time she needed, and she said 1 week, and he waited exactly 1 week. During that same week, on St. Simon's Island, Nolan Delacroix received a video call from a specialist center in the northern part of the state. It wasn't because anyone had paid anyone. Not a single dollar changed hands. It was because his file, the file that had been pushed to the bottom of a stack for 6 years because it lacked one assessment that no one had been willing to sign, was finally picked up by someone, placed on the correct desk, and reviewed the way it should have been. Nolan sent his sister exactly 1 line that evening, and Ruth read it 7 times before turning off her phone. There are debts no one can repay with money. Some debts can only be repaid when one person is willing to stand up and carry the paper to the right desk. 2 months later, the Halloran family home had learned how to breathe again. The hallways were still quieter than before, but they were no longer empty. The household staff had returned in full. The kitchen fires were burning again in the mornings, and sunlight still cut across the stone floor of the great hall at the same angle it had followed for 100 years. Only the eastern wing was different. Its door had remained locked since that week, and no one on the estate asked when it would be opened again. On St. Simon's Island, Nolan Delacroix began teaching a small furniture restoration class on Saturday mornings. He had 6 students, and every one of them was older than he was, one of them by as much as 30 years. He taught them how to recognize a joint that had rotted from within, how to take a chair apart without breaking anything else, and how to wait for the glue to dry instead of growing impatient. On the evening after his first Saturday class, he typed his sister a long message, telling her that teaching other people was much harder than he had imagined. That one older gentleman kept making the same mistake in the same place, and Nolan had been forced to think of 3 different ways to explain the same thing. Then he added one final sentence, saying that he liked it. In the garden, Ruth Delacroix walked between 2 rows of camellias in bloom. Her left leg still carried a slight limp, but her steps were steady, and she no longer lowered her eyes to the ground when she passed someone. Emmett walked beside her, more slowly than he was accustomed to walking. "I think I should go back to work," she said, "but not here. I can't keep cleaning your house. It would feel strange. You won't clean for anyone again." "Then what am I supposed to do?" She stopped and turned toward him. "Sir, I can't simply sit there and receive things. I've never known how to live that way." Emmett stopped beside her. He told her about a foundation his father had established 30 years earlier. A foundation created to help families who couldn't afford medical treatment, families whose files remained forever at the bottom of a stack because no one was willing to pick them up. The foundation had been neglected for a decade. There was still money in it, and its name still existed on paper, but no one was truly taking care of it. "Will you run it?" Ruth looked at him. "I never went to college. Neither did I." He looked toward the far end of the garden. "But I run an entire family. And you supported 2 people with 3 jobs for 6 years without owing anyone so much as a word. You saw 3 months of betrayal inside a house where 8 armed men couldn't see it. And you saved my life with a recorder held together by a rubber band. You are enough, Ruth." She was silent for a while. Then she asked him a question he hadn't expected at all. "Are you afraid? After everything that happened?" "Yes," he said, "but not in the same way as before. I used to be afraid of losing power. Now I'm afraid of something much smaller." "What is it?" He waited a moment. "That one day Nolan will be completely well. You'll have money of your own. You won't need me anymore, and you'll leave." Ruth looked down at her feet, then raised her eyes again. "Mr. Halloran, I'm not staying because I need you. If I stay, it'll be because I want to." He said nothing. He only reached out and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the stone bench. He didn't squeeze it. He didn't hold it. He simply placed his hand there and left it still. And in the western corner of the garden, where 6 weeks earlier there had been nothing but a bare patch of earth, the flower bed he had first planted at 19 was growing again. Green, straight, and nearly a handspan tall. He didn't ask who had replanted it. He already knew. Ladies and gentlemen, this story reminds us of something very simple that people often forget. Betrayal usually wears the face we trust most. Salvation often arrives in a form we barely notice. A person who sweeps the courtyard, a person who waters the plants, someone we pass every morning for 2 months without once asking their name. Loyalty doesn't live in the person who sits at our dinner table every night. It lives in the person who has nothing to gain and still chooses to stand up and protect us. And there is one more thing. Don't make anyone wait 12 years for a promise you never intend to keep, because some disappointments, when neglected for long enough, will quietly grow into something else entirely. Where are you watching this video from? We would truly love to know. How did today's story make you feel? And has there ever been someone in your life who quietly changed the course of your journey through one small act of kindness that brought them nothing in return? Please leave a few lines in the comments below, because we sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. And your words may also help other viewers feel that they aren't alone. If this story touched you, please press the like button, share it with someone you believe may also need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you can enjoy compelling new stories every day. Your support is what allows us to continue telling stories that come from the heart. We wish every one of you watching this video strong health, a joyful and peaceful life each day, and the presence of people who are truly worthy of your heart. Thank you for staying with us until the very last words. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.